All right, let's talk about one of the darkest chapters in all of history, the Black Death. We're going to see how this tiny, microscopic organism didn't just bring a continent to its knees. No, it completely shattered the old world, and from that rubble, it actually laid the foundation for the world we live in today.
That's a pretty wild idea, right? How could the deadliest pandemic in history possibly be a force for good? I mean, we're talking about an event that wiped out maybe half of Europe's entire population. But what if it did have a positive side? That's the paradox we're going to unravel. It's this incredible story of destruction and, somehow, rebirth. So, let's get into it. Okay, so first things first. To really get how the plague could move so fast and be so devastating, you have to picture the world it walked into. And it's not what you might think. We're not talking about isolated little medieval villages. Nope, this was a world that was already deeply, deeply connected. A system that had been built, believe it or not, for thousands of years. See, this whole story really begins with trade, not with tragedy. For literally thousands of years before the plague was even a thing, stuff was moving all across Eurasia. And I don't just mean fancy spices or silk. I'm talking about a constant river of goods, new ideas, and people just flowing back and forth. And that ancient network, well, it accidentally created the perfect superhighway for the deadliest pandemic in human history. Just look at this timeline. It really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? I mean, 4,000 years ago, you've got Chinese millet showing up in Europe. That's a huge deal. It's a tough grain, perfect for people on the move. Fast forward 1,000 years, and European wheat is heading the other way, over to China. And that's a game changer, letting farmers there get 2 harvests a year, which, of course, leads to a population boom. Every one of these steps is like weaving the world a little bit tighter. So by the 1340s, when the Mongol Empire is in full swing, they're not just controlling land. They're running a massive superhighway of trade. The world was way, way smaller than people back then could have ever imagined.
And here's the kicker. It wasn't just goods and ideas traveling on this Silk Road. It was, well, everything. You had game-changing tech like gunpowder moving west and completely changing how wars were fought. But you also had these unseen travelers, little hitchhikers. And this is incredible. Archaeologists found evidence of a parasite, the Chinese liver fluke, at a 2,000-year-old trading post. Now, this parasite can only survive in super wet, marshy parts of China, and they found it 1,500 kilometers away from home. It's kind of gross, I know, but it's the perfect example of just how connected everything and everyone really was. So, you've got this hyper-connected world, and into that world comes a brand new traveler, one that's way, way deadlier than any parasite. It had been building up steam in the east for a while, and then, in the mid-1340s, it finally knocked on Europe's door. You've probably heard the story of the Siege of Kaffa, right? It's one of the most gruesome tales in history. The legend goes that the Mongol army, getting wiped out by the plague, just started catapulting infected bodies over the city walls. A pretty horrific act of biological warfare. And hey, it might have even happened. People wrote about it at the time. But was that the moment the plague broke out in Europe? Probably not. The real story is a bit more complicated. With all those other trade routes on land and sea, Kaffa was probably just one of many places where the infection seeped into Europe, not the single starting point everyone thinks it was.
And for anyone who caught it, my gosh, it was just horrifying and so fast. A writer from that time, Giovanni Boccaccio, described it in chilling detail. First, you'd get these tumors, these swellings in your armpits or groin, the buboes, that would swell up to the size of an egg. Then those would spread. After that came the black and purple spots all over your body, which is where the name Black Death comes from. And then, that was it. Death. Usually within about 3 days. There was no time to even say goodbye. And that terror, it just ripped society apart at the seams. This quote from Boccaccio, wow. It says it all. Brother abandoned brother. Fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children. Think about that. The fear was so absolute, so overwhelming, that it destroyed the most basic human connections, parent and child, husband and wife. It wasn't just that people were dying. The very fabric of society was dissolving into nothing. So, in the face of this unimaginable horror, where do you turn? Well, people looked to the 2 biggest pillars of their world for help, the church and doctors. They were looking for answers, for comfort, for a cure. And as we're about to see, both of them failed. Completely. Just let this number sink in for a second. 40%. That's the estimated number of priests in Europe who died. These were the guys who were supposed to have a direct line to God, the ones giving last rites and spiritual guidance, and they were dying at a crazy rate, a lot of the time because they were the ones on the front lines tending to the sick. Can you imagine being a regular person and seeing that? Seeing your priests just as helpless as you were? It would have been a massive crisis of faith.
And it wasn't just the church. The entire medical field just collapsed. Before the plague, medicine was all based on these ancient Greek ideas about the four humors in your body. Doctors thought you got sick because of an imbalance, maybe from bad air, or even because the planets weren't lined up right. Seriously. And when the plague showed up, yeah, none of that worked. At all. And that total failure forced a revolution. Out of those ashes, a whole new approach to medicine was born. A practical one. People started focusing on surgery, on actually studying the human body by dissecting it, and we saw the birth of public health ideas we still use today, like quarantine. The church's failure was just as massive. I mean, people did everything they were told to do. They prayed, they marched in processions, they bought religious trinkets, and the dying just didn't stop. It got so bad that the Pope himself, Clement VI, did something unheard of. He granted a blanket get-out-of-sin-free card to everyone who died of the plague. It was a complete break from tradition, basically an admission that they had no power to stop it. And that opened up a crack in the church's authority, a crack that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation.
So this wasn't just about a crisis of faith. The plague literally rewired society from the ground up. The sheer number of dead people set off an economic and social earthquake, one that brought a system that had been in place for 1,000 years crashing down. Up to 50%. That means maybe 1 out of every 2 people you knew, gone. It's a number that's so big, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. We're talking about entire villages just erased from the map, bustling cities turned into ghost towns overnight. And when you have that many people disappear, the entire balance of power is going to shift radically.
And here's how that shift happened. It's basic supply and demand, really. Before the plague, you had tons of people, so labor was cheap. Peasants were basically stuck, tied to the land with almost no rights. But after the plague, suddenly workers were incredibly rare and incredibly valuable. The few peasants who survived could now demand more money, better living conditions. They could even pack up and leave for a better job. The rich landowners tried to fight it, of course, but the genie was out of the bottle. The whole economic system of feudalism was broken.
And this new economic power, it led to huge social changes. That old, strict class system started to fall apart. When the nobles tried to clamp down and go back to the old ways, peasants revolted, like the big one in London in 1381. You also had women stepping into brand new roles. With so many men gone, widows were suddenly running businesses and owning land, things that were almost unheard of before. And you can even see the change in art and culture. On one hand, you get this morbid obsession with death, the dance macabre. But on the other, you get this carpe diem, seize the day attitude from the people who made it through. Okay, so all of that is world-changing stuff, but it brings us to the most surprising part of this whole story, something that seems to go against all logic. Because beyond all the social and economic shifts, modern science is showing us another consequence of the plague, and this one is a real shocker. So here's the question. After centuries of famine and being overworked, is it possible that the people who survived the Black Death were actually healthier? I know, it sounds crazy, right? How could a population that just went through hell on earth come out the other side stronger? But that's exactly what the scientific evidence is starting to tell us. So how do we know this? Well, scientists did this incredible study in London. They looked at hundreds and hundreds of skeletons from cemeteries, and they were able to figure out who died before the plague and who died after. And by analyzing the bones, they could piece together a picture of what life was like for these people, how healthy they were, how long they lived. And the results were crystal clear. The people who lived after the plague were healthier. They lived longer. Their chances of dying at any age were lower than for the generation before them. So why? Well, it seems to be 2 things. First, the plague was a selective event. It tended to kill off people who were already old or sick. And second, for the survivors, life actually got better. With fewer mouths to feed and higher wages, they had access to way more food and better food. It's just incredible. A horrific catastrophe had accidentally created a healthier, more resilient generation. So the story of the Black Death really teaches us a powerful lesson, doesn't it? That catastrophe, as brutal as it is, can be a massive catalyst for change. It just wipes the slate clean and forces people to adapt or die out.
And it leaves us with a pretty challenging question to think about for our own world, right? When we face our own major crises, are we brave enough to let go of the old ways to make room for something new? Something maybe even better?